I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Today, we're looking at the latest 2021 MacBook Pro computer from Apple. The question is, how well will it perform for musicians and as a studio centerpiece? So here's a scenario. This is my personal computer, which I ordered on the day the new machines were announced, and I received it just a few weeks ago. What happened was, my old MacBook Pro had reached retirement age, let's say. I bought it back in 2014, and it's been a faithful companion ever since, and I upgraded it through the years myself with expanded RAM and a bigger internal drive and so on. But after millions of miles of travel, literally, and untold hours of use, it was showing some signs of wear and tear. But what held me back from upgrading until now is I wanted a new laptop that'd be a big enough jump in power to make it worth the move, but I also wanted a full array of ports and connectivity and features, and some of the interim MacBook Pros weren't offering all of that. But with the latest generation MacBook Pros, Apple's finally delivered what I've been waiting for. Now, I won't lie to you, it was a big spend to get this new machine. It's a costly machine, but I justified it based on how much I got out of my last laptop. I owned that laptop for more than 7 years, and I look at these sorts of things on a cost per use basis or a cost per use hour basis. So looking at it that way, I owned that computer for literally pennies a day or pennies per hour. And assuming I keep this laptop for as long, the cost per use will be similarly low by the time I'm finished with it. So to me, it's worth it. This machine provides an amazing combination of speed, storage, memory, connectivity, and an absolutely stunning display. Plus, for this MacBook Pro, Apple brought back the function keys, extended the battery life, and made the machine way more efficient. So let's take a closer look. What I bought is a 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max processor. The processor offers 10 cores plus a 16-core neural engine. It has a 24-core GPU or graphics processing unit, 64 gigabytes of memory, and a 4 terabyte internal solid-state drive. So I maxed everything out except for the GPU, which could go to 32 cores, and the internal drive, which could go to 8 terabytes. The GPU is primarily concerned with video performance, which isn't a big deal. It's not essential to me. And the price to go to an 8 terabyte drive just seemed a bit too high. But 4 terabytes for the drive has been working out great. I have plenty of room with that much space. One thing I really like with this machine is that Apple's gone back to the MagSafe charger port. Plus, it has 3 Thunderbolt 4 or USB-C ports, an SD card reader built in, a headphone jack, and it has an HDMI 2.0 port for connecting to an external monitor. And depending on the monitor you're using, you can also connect displays to the Thunderbolt ports if you need multiple displays or if you want the best display resolution. With all that said, now that you know what's in this machine, let's take a little closer look at what all that means for musicians. There are 2 models of MacBook Pro being offered, one with a 14.2-inch display and this one which has a 16.2-inch display. There are some differences. The 16-inch offers longer battery life, up to 21 hours, while the 14-inch provides up to 17 hours, and in most cases both of those are just fine. The 16-inch can drive up to 3 external displays at 6K resolution, while the 14-inch can do 2 external displays at that resolution. Both offer a great sounding 6-speaker sound system. It sounds fantastic for built-in speaker system. It has Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5, and the hard drives inside are 2 times faster than the internal drives on previous machines, and that last one is one of the biggest things for many musicians. Both the 14 and the 16-inch offer the same complement of ports, similar display quality. They have that gorgeous mini LED displays with incredible resolution. Now to me, the bigger screen was worth the extra size and weight. It's about a pound heavier than the 14-inch, but I work with a lot of music notation, I do a little bit of video work, and I wanted to see as many tracks and plugins as possible. But the bigger differences are under the hood. Either the 14-inch or the 16-inch can be configured with the M1 Pro or M1 Max processors. For either processor, you can get up to a 10-core CPU, which is a big jump over the original M1 chip. You get a 16-core neural engine, which deals mostly with machine learning. There's also a media engine for video, a video decode engine, and a display engine for driving external monitors in both of them. But there are differences too. And to be honest, most of these are only going to be of interest to those doing heavy video work and won't affect us much in the music and audio world. For example, the M1 Pro offers up to a 16-core GPU, while the M1 Max offers up to a 32-core GPU. And the M1 Pro offers single ProRes and video encoder engines, while the M1 Max offers dual ProRes and video encoder engines. But again, those really only matter if you're doing heavy video work. They're not going to affect working in a DAW, for example. Where I did see a difference though, and what pushed me to get the M1 Max, is that the M1 Pro supports up to 32 gigabytes of memory, while the M1 Max can do up to 64 gigabytes. And I wanted that increased memory for large libraries, bigger caches, and so on. Plus, the M1 Max's memory is twice as fast, 400 gigabytes per second versus 200 gigabytes per second on the M1 Pro. So for me, the tipping point was support for more and faster memory. And overall, the M1 Max is definitely a more powerful processor as shown by many benchmarks. But for most applications, the M1 Pro will be just fine, particularly if 32 gigabytes of memory is enough for your needs. I should mention that the memory is implemented differently with the M1 chips than with previous Intel chips in Macs, so even 16 gigabytes may be just fine if you don't use huge libraries in your audio productions. Now let's move on to a big topic. The new MacBook Pros all use proprietary Apple silicon versus the Intel chips that were used in previous generations, and this is a huge shift. Some of you may remember when Apple did the whole PowerPC to Intel shift a number of years ago, and this is a similar change. The deal is, in order to run on Apple silicon, meaning the M1 chips, apps need to be rewritten with what's called Universal 2 code. This allows them to run native on the M1 chip and to take advantage of all that chip offers, while still allowing the app to be backward compatible with earlier computers running Intel chips. The problem is not all developers have updated their apps, so Apple provided an emulator called Rosetta 2 that allows Intel-only software to run on the M1 chips. Rosetta 2 is designed to be a temporary solution. It's designed to give developers time to update their software, basically. Now, depending on who you talk to, some may say the update to Universal 2 compatibility is fairly straightforward and easy, while others say it's a lot of work. With music and audio software, we're starting to see apps that support Universal 2, while others, of course, are still lagging behind. In particular, many developers are waiting for Pace, who makes the iLock, to update their copy protection software, which Pace says will be happening very soon. In the meantime, just about everything I've tested seems to run fine either as native M1 or under Rosetta 2. I've tried a bunch of software and plugins, and only a few things wouldn't run at all. However, there can be a performance hit when you're running under Rosetta 2, so hopefully everything will be updated soon. Now, of course, that begs a big question. How can I tell what's native and what uses Rosetta? And there are a few different ways to check. First, of course, you can ask the manufacturer. You can also go to System Report, which is under the Apple, About This Mac, System Report, and then click Applications. Once it catches up, pull this down, we'll see we have Kind over here. Universal, Intel, and this tells you all your various apps and whether they're compatible with Universal or Intel. To check the apps and processes that are currently running on your Mac, you can open up Activity Monitor, which you find in the Utilities folder inside the Application folder. This shows you a lot of information on apps and processes that are currently running or currently active. What we're interested in is the Kind setting over here. You can sort these by CPU usage and so on, but if we sort by kind, we can see that all these processes that are running in the background are running under Intel or Rosetta, while the rest of these labeled Apple are all running native. Now, some of these processes are things like, this is Pace licensing here, the license daemon. There's an Avid process that's running, Dropbox is running a process, and so on. Now, I experimented with shutting some of these processes down, and I found that even though they were running Intel, they're not impacting the performance of my machine in any noticeable way, so I'm not too worried about those processes. But the best way I've found to check Universal 2 compatibility is with a free app called Architect. I've got that open here. Now with this, you can open up any app or you can open up any plugin. So for example, we could open up UID meter and control panel. We can see that it is compatible with Apple Silicon. It also tells us that down here, Mach 0 Universal, and so on. So this tells us that this is compatible. If we open something that's not compatible, for example, the Apogee Effects Rack, we'll see that Apple Silicon is not selected here, and we don't have that same indicator here of it being compatible. With Architect, you can look at universal support for any app or bundle on your machine, meaning you can check apps, plugins, and more. And I found this really useful as I sorted through my plugins and virtual instruments in particular. Now this is an issue because even if an app is running native or Universal 2, if you install a plugin or instrument that's Intel only, it could affect performance. In fact, if we open Activity Monitor back up, I have Studio One open as well, and we can see that it's running under Apple. Now if we jump over to Studio One, and we add a plugin that's not native, so for example, if we go to Reverb Foundry, add HD Cart, it will open up, and now when we go back to Activity Monitor, if we look over here at Kind, to the top, we can see that something called AU Hosting Compatibility Service is now open. If we select that and get information, we can see that it's running Studio One. So this service or aspect of Rosetta is allowing you to run that non-native plugin inside of the native Studio One DAW. But you can also see that it's using a fair amount of CPU processing, 3.19% right there for just that one plugin. It's also using up some memory and so on. Now, how much power a given plugin is using when we're running that AU hosting service depends, of course. Plugins use different amounts of CPU power and so on, and there are a lot of variables. But the good news is, with these M1 Pro and M1 Max machines, they're so fast and so powerful, even apps and plugins that are running 100% under Rosetta will likely be as fast or faster than running the same app on an older Intel machine, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And with native apps and plugins, you get super fast, really snappy response. Now at this point, as of today, several DAWs are native M1, including Persona Studio One, Motu Digital Performer, FL Studio, and Bitwig, for example, and I'm sure we'll see more soon. Plugins and instruments from TuneTrack, Leapwing, UVI, Waves, FabFilter, Eventide, Newfangled Audio, and more are also native. And I was interested and surprised to find that when I checked Universal Audio's UAD apps and plugins, their Audio Units plugins are native, as is the UAD meter and control panel, but the rest of their apps and plugin formats such as VST and the console are not yet compatible, but I do know that they're working on compatibility and should be available soon. I should also mention that I had no problem using my Universal Audio satellite and Apollo Audio interfaces with my DAWs and plugins with my new computer. And speaking of hardware, anything that's class compliant and doesn't require a driver should work just fine. I've tried a number of different audio interfaces with this computer and all of them have worked perfectly. Now, if an audio interface or control surface needs a driver or other software to operate, it'll have to be updated to be M1 compatible, but it may still work okay running under Rosetta 2, so you should definitely check it out before you purchase. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here so far with lots of information. Let's close things out today by looking at some real-world tests of just how powerful this computer is. As a reminder, what I've got here is an M1 Max with 64 gigabytes of memory, and I was running all the tracks off the internal hard drive for these tests. First, I did a series of tests running Persona Studio One, since it and all the plugins that come with it, all the instruments that come with it, are all M1 native. The results are pretty awe-inspiring. With Studio One, with the buffer set to 512, I could easily play back 1,000 tracks, and could probably have done a lot more. Plus, I could add an EQ and compressor to each track. That's 1,000 tracks with 1,000 EQ plugins and 1,000 compressor plugins. And then I added 5 sends to each track, feeding into 5 reverb plugins. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And there was still headroom available to run more tracks and more plugins. Next, I dropped the Studio One buffer down to the lowest setting of 16. At this setting, you could monitor through plugins while tracking or overdubbing with virtually no noticeable latency. And I was able to get 700 tracks to play back, each with an EQ plugin, plus I could add 5 compressor plugins before the computer topped out. Again, those are just crazy numbers. Some plugins use more CPU power than others, of course, so I created another session, set the buffer to 512, added 500 tracks, and I was able to instantiate 500 of the brand new Waves SSL EV2 channel strip plugin, which is native M1 compatible. FabFilter plugins are also some of my favorites, and they're also M1 compatible. I created a new session with the buffer at 256 this time, and added 500 tracks. Then I instantiated 500 FabFilter EQs, 500 FabFilter compressors, 3 FabFilter reverbs on sends coming from every track. To finish things up, I processed the master bus with a FabFilter limiter and a multiband processor. It all worked perfectly. And when I swapped in some non-native plugins, I got very similar results. For example, on my session with 1,000 tracks, 1,000 EQs, and 1,000 compressors, I was able to swap in non-native plugins from Reverb Foundry, Apogee, Eventide, and Soundtoys without any problems. Now, to test performance with virtual instruments, I created a session in Studio One and loaded up TuneTrack Easy Drummer, Easy Bass, and Easy Keys, all of which are native. Then I added 4 instances of Native Instruments Contact, which is not native, 4 instances of Native Instruments Massive, which is also not native, and 4 instances of UVI Workstation, which is native. Now, playing all those tracks simultaneously from individual MIDI tracks, the computer load topped out at just 25%. There was still plenty of room available for lots more tracks, plugins, and instruments. Next, I moved over to Pro Tools, which is currently Intel only. In this case, I could get 1,000 tracks, 1,000 EQs, and 1,000 compressors, all non-native, and I could load up 3 reverb plugins on sends after that. So not quite as much as the fully native app, but still so far over the top that the numbers are almost ludicrous. I also dropped the Pro Tools buffer as low as possible down to 32, and I was still able to play back 1,000 tracks without any problems. Again, this is low enough to allow for tracking and overdubbing with plugins. That should give you an idea of just how much power is on tap with these new MacBook Pro laptops from Apple. It's a huge leap forward over the performance of previous generation machines in virtually every way. And I don't have to tell you that these numbers are so far over the top as to be almost ridiculous. I mean, I never even have a fraction that many tracks, plugins, or instruments running simultaneously in a session. But of course, there are certainly situations where you could still outrun the power available from the computer. But for me, with my new MacBook Pro, available computer processing power has basically become a non-issue. My old laptop could do an amazing job of running a bunch of tracks and plugins, but these new MacBook Pro laptops are simply amazing. And by the way, I've also found all this, which has been running under Apple's new latest Monterey operating system, to be super stable. I've been pushing this machine really hard for a couple of weeks, and I've only had one crash with it, which was probably my fault for trying to swap around too many things at once. And one other side note, in the time I've spent with this computer, I've never heard the cooling fan come on, not once, which is a big improvement over my old MacBook Pro and its noisy fan that ran almost all the time. Either these new machines run so cool they don't use the fan much, or the fan is super quiet, but either way, I'm very happy to not have to deal with fan noise anymore. I should also mention that all this information is current as of November 29th, 2021 when we shot this video. Apps and plugins are being updated constantly, so be sure to check with the manufacturer or with your Sweetwater sales engineer, or you can visit Sweetwater's SweetCare site for the latest up-to-the-minute information and for advice on which MacBook Pro would be the best choice for your needs. So when it's all said and done, are these new machines a good choice for musicians and for studio work? In my opinion, absolutely no question. I'm completely thrilled with my purchase of this computer. I expect that it's going to be a centerpiece of my music making for a long, long time to come. Now, if you have questions about anything you've seen in this video, or to learn more about computers and software for music and audio production, contact your Sweetwater sales engineer or visit sweetwater.com. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater.